It's my great pleasure to introduce this next panel. The panel title is Eugenics, Anthropology, and Reparations in the Pacific. And we have a really stellar lineup of folks who will be presenting, including Ingrid Ahlgren, Hilary Howes, Matt Matsuda, and Nathan Rue. And yeah, I think they're presenting in that order. And so I thought I'll just introduce each of them before they go into their talks. Our first speaker will be Ingrid, and the title of her talk is American National Identity, Anthropology, and Their Archives. Dr. Ingrid Ahlgren is the curator for oceanic collections at the Peabody Museum of Archaeology and Ethnology at Harvard University, as well as a research associate at the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of Natural History, and a collaborating scholar rediscovering the Deep Human Past Laureate Program, the Australian National University. Born and raised in the Republic of the Marshall Islands, RMI, Ingrid has worked in the Pacific Islands for over 10 years as an anthropologist, collaborating with the RMI's Ministry of Culture and Internal Affairs, EPA, Ministry of Health, Alel National Museum, and various NGOs. Her publications cover diverse topics in the Pacific region: health, conservation, and environmental change, sacred beliefs, and cultural heritage. Yet all are centered around unpacking colonial histories and impacts towards promoting oceanic dignities and sovereignties. With that, I'll turn it over to you, Ingrid. Thank you.
Thank you, Miley. Thank you, Benedict. I'm really excited to be here today. I'm thrilled to be on this panel with some incredible scholars and humans that I really admire. So I'm humbled and honored. I am going to start out first by thanking the people of the Marshall Islands, because it is because of them and with them and for them that I am here today. I wouldn't be here personally or professionally without the kindness and generosity. And I hope that through the years that I can reciprocate it in a way that is meaningful. I also want to acknowledge that I am calling in today from Arlington, Massachusetts, which is the homeland of the Massachusetts people. And I put some information about them in the chat. I'm excited again, like I said, to be here. A little nervous, but I'm excited about going first because I think what I'm going to do is kind of give a longer historical perspective. But I think we'll set up some, and I hope we'll set up some fruitful conversations with the rest of the panelists and kind of go into them. So as my abstract says, while the eugenics movement is commonly associated with its gain in popularity in the early 20th century, and I do have some slides, so I'm hesitant to use them. So the eugenics movement, it's associated with the early 20th century, 1900s, 1910s, 1920s. The anthropology and race science, however, in the United States were tools and allies for superiority politics much earlier, as part of a uniquely American concept of nationhood and exceptionalism. And the foundational American concept of a national identity based on freedom and justice for all was necessarily challenged and has been shown to be quite hypocritical over the years through its practices in slavery, the removal of Native Americans through the Indian Removal Act and other practices. And for the sake of this discussion, colonial expansion overseas. There's a lot of research, excellent research done on race in the Pacific. So today I'm going to try and link it more to the language of the eugenics movement and applied anthropology and physical anthropology and the accumulation and creation of a human data archive that remains accessed to this day in institutions like museums, universities, archives, libraries, etc. We think about eugenics, we think about terms like progress, and I'm looking in the glowing words of eugenics rather than the other terms of that we've heard so far. So the glowing terms, you know, like progress, betterment, improvement, that are part of this fundamental idealist mentality where science is raised up, and in this case, Americans are seen as the saviors in American science. I suggest this language and mentality is linked to the longer legacy of American promotion of useful knowledge, but useful for who? So I'm going to attempt to go through about 200 years of history in just 10 minutes, which is probably now only a few minutes left. And so there's going to be there's going to be some gaps, there's going to be contexts that are left unsaid, viewpoints that are not highlighted, and there are definitely some selective quotes and moments in some of these slides, which were pieced together from some other talks I've given. So you're going to see a whole bunch of different fonts and things. So I apologize. It's not very glitzy. So as the United States heads into sort of the Jacksonian era, the antebellum period that's often associated with scientific racism, this is the US at its pubescence. It's this important time of uneasiness and conflict, instability. There's all these philosophical aspirations that don't meet up to the realities, to what's happening on the quote unquote frontiers. You've got this westward expansion that means closer interaction with a variety of quote unquote races. And there becomes this sense of immediacy to construct a racial model for the American society that's different than Europe. Than its monarchies and inherited class structures. Particularly Andrew Jackson pushes back against European ideas and said that the United States is kind of wild and raw. You get sort of this bootstrap sort of mentality at that time. One perspective on this aspect of history is that science steps up to help ease the instability and create the building blocks for constructing an American racial view. It's important to note that the scientific elite at the time that were brought in to sort of be part of this are all in kind of New England, not all, but primarily in New England and Northeast. And they all are also in the same circles as politicians that are all hanging out together in these same sort of teak leather rooms and discussing things together. They're in the sort of area of the seats of governmental power. So they already had decades of kind of exposure to learned and philosophical societies that will play an important role in how science and politics start to mutually affirm each other. You have sort of these quotes here, which are kind of showing a little bit of the change in mentality over time and some of the hypocrisy that will continue to grow. As I said, you've got these philosophical societies that have boiled up since the 1700s. In this case, you can see here by this quote about how it shifts from just this kind of intellectual endeavor to needs and wants and the means of supplying wants. And one of those needs or wants was commercial expansion overseas. So that's where we dive into the justification of the U.S. exploring expedition and the commercial desires. And that's, the U.S. exploring expedition was really originally supposedly the motivations were based on protecting the whaling industry and commerce abroad. Of course, additional objectives sort of multiply and also come to light. And you can see that a lot of that actually has to do with an American science and discovering Terra Australis or Antarctica and contributing to this stock of knowledge. I bring this up as an important point and moment in time since this is where the government really starts funding American science. So after the exploring expedition, the United States spends for many years 1/4 to 1/3 of its annual federal budget on scientific research. It's also important because it brings back a huge amount of data, bring about different peoples. It brings back a huge amount of cultural heritage items. It's kind of the part of the impetus and the beginnings of the Smithsonian. And that accumulation of data becomes really important as I continue in this talk. So the rise of scientism is important for a couple reasons in the Pacific, two kind of categories that I'm thinking of within the Pacific context is to inform and justify the claiming and the governance of colonies abroad, and also seeing the Pacific as a petri dish or laboratory that many other people have talked about thus far in this symposium. This for testing out hypotheses, enacting hypotheses regarding miscegenation, admixture, erasure, assimilation, etc. And so you have this. You go from this promotion of useful knowledge to the application of useful knowledge as you go into the 20th century. I'm going to attempt to talk just very, very, very quickly of a few examples in the beginning of the 20th century where I see this playing out. Some of these have been studied more than others. I'm breezing through them, but I hope they illustrate the point about the language that's used, the justifying morale that's being used at the time, and ethic that's being used at the time. But I am going to whiz through some of these. I'm going to start with the Philippines and benevolent assimilation at the end of the 19th century, where the US purportedly frees a whole bunch of areas from centuries of Spanish rule. And you will see that initially the United States, it's an interesting example because the American populace does not want to actually go into the Philippines and rule them because it's really hypocritical. But the United States, McKinley decides that they are going to intervene, and they're going to be there primarily because of geostrategic and economic reasons. But you can also see, and so McKinley and Taft pull together a whole bunch of scientific group of people. A lot of people come from Harvard, Agassiz, and Putnam to send out a whole slew of anthropologists and other lay scientists, to be honest with you, to collect information to govern the people. But what you can also kind of see is there's this discussion of people's being unprepared, unfit, I would argue, is another word that's used, the welfare of people. But also you see this sort of idea about the contributions to human knowledge. Of course, the useful knowledge gets used as propaganda for convincing the American public. This is a very famous set of photographs that were placed together. This one individual and selling to the American government people, that is over time. 3 minutes, good gracious. Okay. I'm just going to throw in some other Pacific Island examples here that continue through this time period. The Pan-Pacific Symposium of 1920, which is, of course, really close to the Eugenics Conference in 1921. And you can see terminology here about scientific problems, methods for their solutions. The field of anthropology gets referred to in here as race relations in the Pacific. You can see how this gets applied in racial laboratories. We've already heard a little bit about that Eugenics Symposium with Hawaii and the study of miscegenation. I think what I want to point out here is that many of these studies that happen here are from data that's collected by some people and then analyzed by other people. And that's kind of unique and an interesting point that has to do with the accumulation of data. Obviously, you're not going to be able to read this material, and that's on purpose. It is to share that even when anthropological studies were not physical in nature, people like Douglas Oliver were encouraged to go out and include anthropometric data so that they could create this large archive of material that other scholars could look into. So there you're taking human qualities and traits, and you are pulling them out and making them into mathematical sort of data sets, right? And it no longer matters their value of the actual indigenous people and their qualities as individuals or societies, but they are simply data points at this time. The Navy, of course, gets involved after World War II, or the Trust Territory of the Pacific. You get, again, these two large archives that become collated, particularly with Yale and the HRAF, the Human Relations Area files, that are used to collect information, particularly about quote unquote Micronesian people. And what's interesting here is that Yale and other institutions actually, they send out anthropologists and students to compile this information that will later be used for governance. Love this quote. You can go anywhere out in the bush in these islands and you'll step on a PhD. A lot of these have to do with depopulation and adaptation to places like harsh atoll environments, which we've already heard about yesterday a little bit. I'm going to use this one example of abortion and depopulation in Yap. People thought, oh, it must be some cultural thing that they're doing. They're aborting people. There's infanticide, something, but spoiler alert, it was actually the introduction of diseases. This trend carries on. Okay, this carries on through the 1960s with the International Biological Project. You have the Harvard Solomons Project that goes out to the Solomons and collects an incredibly large amount of data sets from medical doctors and dentists and other people. And I want to end on this point. Sorry to breeze through a lot of that. But I want to end on this point where now you have this large set of archives throughout a whole range of places. And what do we do now? That material still is there. And so, there's this idea of repatriation of human remains. But what about the data? What about the casts and the life masks? What about the EKGs that were taken, the blood samples that were taken, the hair samples that are taken? I'm just using this one example of this article here. A lot of the material that was collected in the 20th century was dispersed to many different laboratories and universities, where that material can theoretically still be accessed and used again. And that is something that people like myself that work in museums have to think carefully through about how to bring justice to the people who these samples belong to. That's a lot. Thanks for the extra minute. I will leave it there. I'm looking forward to discussion about some of these issues. So thanks.
Yeah, thanks so much, Ingrid. Our next presenter is Hilary Howes, and she'll be presenting on Long Shadows, Physical Anthropology, Race Science, and Repatriation. Dr. Hilary Howes is an Australian Research Council DECRA Fellow based in the Centre for Heritage and Museum Studies at the Australian National University. Since July 2022, she's been on secondment to the German Embassy in Canberra, working as Head of Science and Innovation, and more recently as advisor to the Special Envoy for the Pacific Islands. Her DECRA project, Skulls for the Tsar, Indigenous Human Remains in the Collections of Imperial Russia, aims to produce the first detailed investigation of the acquisition of Indigenous human remains from Australia, New Zealand, and the broader Pacific by the Russian Empire during the long 19th century. Her research to date addresses the German-speaking tradition within anthropology and archaeology in Australia and the Pacific region. Thanks. I'll turn it over to you, Hilary.
Thanks so much. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land I live and work on, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people here in Canberra, and paying my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and also extending those respects to any other First Nations people who are here today. I think when Benedict invited me to participate in this symposium, I was a bit uncertain as to what I could contribute. So as Miley was saying, I've focused to date on provenance research related to requests for the repatriation of ancestral remains to the traditional owners, and particularly ancestral remains of Indigenous people from Australia and the Pacific held in German collecting institutions. And really, eugenics as a concept has almost never appeared in the scientific publications and the correspondence and field journals that are my core sources of historical information about the circumstances under which ancestral remains were taken, the justifications for taking them, and the conclusions drawn from any further research conducted on them. Those are examples of, on the screen, a couple of handover ceremonies where I had some involvement in the provenance research. This, I just found it was helpful to go back to the dictionary definition of eugenics, because I find, I mean, it's, I guess, quite commonly used in everyday parlance just to mean racist research. And of course, it was racist research, but I think that probably is not a sufficiently accurate description. I should say that provenance research is always full of gaps, so really it's hard to say with complete certainty that any individual ancestral remain was never subject to any eugenic research. But I'd still say that my general impression is that it was pretty rare, and I think that's probably for two reasons. So really, first, most ancestral remains that I have had anything to do with never seem to have been subjected to any further research once they entered a collection. Maybe their arrival was briefly documented in the minutes of a scientific society's monthly meeting or a museum's annual report, but in most cases they never appeared in the scientific literature again. And really, I think there's a trophy hunting element to this that perhaps is underappreciated. So, you know, scientific institutions today that are opposed to repatriation will often trot out this idea that, oh, these ancestral remains must be retained for the benefit of humankind. They're very important for scientific research. Well, that's not what you see if you look at the historical literature. They just enter the collection and that's it. They're just there. in cases where ancestor remains were subject to further research, it tended to be older school anatomical or physical anthropological research. And my impression is that researchers who were interested in the newer sciences of genetics and heredity, which were more closely connected to eugenics, seem to have concentrated on studies of living populations, such as the ones that Ingrid was mentioning, as being better suited to tracing the inheritance of particular characteristics, or to some extent, I guess, on biological samples such as blood samples, which has not been so much my area of expertise. And really, German language scientific studies of ancestral remains from Australia and the Pacific region often seem to have amounted to just something like this very, very detailed lists of a whole range of measurements, generally of the skull, sometimes of other skeletal elements. Maybe there was some attempt to allocate individual ancestral remains to a particular, quote, race on the basis of their form, or to identify skeletal features that were supposedly common to individuals of a particular race, or compare different races with the intention of establishing how closely related they might be. And clearly these studies were shot through with racialist and often racist assumptions, but I don't think they were often explicitly eugenic assumptions. I would say, though, that some assumptions and preoccupations could be described as eugenic adjacent. So there was a lot of interest in distinguishing between pure and mixed races. And in the case of anatomical and physical anthropological studies, that's largely because it was thought that the ancestral remains of mixed race individuals were less reliable and less consistent in their form and characteristics. So you find that collectors and researchers often go to a lot of trouble to explain in detail why they're convinced that the ancestral remains that they have obtained or that they are studying are absolutely, definitely, certainly, undoubtedly those of racially pure individuals. Not necessarily with the background thought that there's some kind of biological superiority to racially pure individuals, but sometimes that is also there. And I've also found examples of researchers explaining away ancestral remains whose measurements don't fit their preconceived ideas of what a particular race should look like by suggesting that the individuals in question must have been of mixed race. So, you know, kind of circular logic there. Suggestions of unfit or dying races are also relatively common. There usually wasn't much attempt to identify exactly which biological characteristics might have been to blame for this. It seems to have been more something that a collector or researcher would refer to in order to emphasize the significance of his or her collection or research. I mean, the argument was that if particular races were dying out, that was all the more reason to take and study their ancestral remains before the opportunity was lost forever. And here on the screen, you can see, I think Ingrid was mentioning life casts, and the photo shows the return of a life cast of a Maori ancestor to Ngāti Toa iwi, the tribe that ancestor belonged to. And that was from a collection where the collector was arguing that the races represented in the collection were dying out. And that made the collection all the more important. Really, I've only found one example to date of a researcher attempting to draw conclusions about inherited characteristics on the basis of a comparative examination of the skulls. That's Adolf Bernhard Meyer, who was a German traveller, naturalist, and museum director, and he published in detail on 135 skulls he had taken from various locations in what's now West Papua, as you see on the map there. And he suggested, among other things, that the differences between the sexes were retained amongst more savage peoples to a greater extent than they are amongst us, as in Germans or Europeans. He argued that he'd never seen what he called robust or mannish women in New Guinea, and contrasted that with women of the European working class. He then argued that Papuan men worked harder than Papuan women, which was internally contradictory to some of the other things he said, but you know. And he argued that Papuan men as a result, would never exhibit what he called the feminine type, that European men who undertook sedentary occupations rather than hard physical work could adopt and then, he believed, bequeath to their successors. I mean, funnily enough, it never seems to have occurred to him that he was one of the people engaging in those sedentary occupations, but no, I don't think any of us is surprised about that. He didn't explicitly state that what he called a blurring of the difference between male and female was undesirable, but I think the implication was there. And it becomes even clearer when he wrote that he and a colleague examined 117 criminal skulls from the museum's collection. They conjectured as to the sex of those skulls, and then they checked their conjectures against documentary records to see what kind of an accuracy they had. And he noted that they had an approximately 10% error rate, but he justified that by saying he thought that criminals who'd spent much of their lives in jail couldn't develop unimpeded with respect to sexual characteristics, and that in particular the women's skulls that he had erroneously identified as male had maybe been preconceived by nature with a habitus which steered them involuntarily into their criminal courses, so they were pathological skulls. And given that the museum's collection of criminal skulls included specimens listed as murderers, thieves, arsonists, suicides, fornicators, whores, and idiots, I think it's pretty clear that their categorization as pathological reflected very strong preconceptions of what constituted normal, healthy, acceptable behavior, and also a normal, healthy, acceptable physical appearance. And I'm afraid that's all I have time for, but I'll be happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Hillary. Let's see, our next presenter is Matt Matsuda. Sorry, let me find. So the title of Matt's talk will be Entangled Histories of Genomes and Islands. And Matt teaches modern European and Asia-Pacific global comparative histories in the Rutgers, New Brunswick History Department, where he has been since 1993. He's the author of The Memory of the Modern, published in 1996, Empire Love, published in 2003, and Pacific Worlds, published in 2012, as well as a primer for teaching Pacific histories, published in 2020, articles and essays, and he's also a volume editor for the Cambridge History of the Pacific Ocean, published this year in 2023. He's also founding editor of Palgrave Studies in Pacific Histories, currently 7 volumes ranging over histories of anthropology, science, Oceanian empire, and early modern commodity trading. His own current work is a study of history, genealogies, genomics, and decolonization politics in the Pacific. From 2015 to 2021, he was the founding academic dean, professor in residence at the Honors College, New Brunswick. He has also previously served as the dean of the School of Arts and Sciences Honors Program and as College Avenue campus dean. He is currently the director of the Gardner Fellows Program in Social Policy at Rutgers. I'll turn it over to you, Matt. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you very much, Miley. I'm sorry about all the administrative mentions at the end. I didn't intend for that to be included. That was just to, I have a lot of respect for people who organize things, and this has been tremendous. Thank you. As my colleagues, my respects also to the peoples, the cultures and histories that we are discussing today. As Miley mentioned, I'm working on Entangled Histories, Genomes, and Islands. And basically the way this has come to me is through a series of stories. That is in sort of academic history, there is a period in the second half of the 20th century which signals a global age of decolonization struggles with which all of you are familiar. And including in the Pacific Islands, as kind of a category of historical thinking, the period of decolonization. It's also true that in the mid-20th century, in the 1950s, this was the era of the articulation, famously, of the DNA double helix, and the increasing studies of genetics, genomics, and also radiation studies because of atomic testing in the Pacific. And so what happens when these histories, that is basically Pacific Islands decolonization and genomic science, are then studied together? This was really the question that I wanted to pursue. So there are foundational arguments which come together through articulations of new kinds of ways of thinking about what pasts are and how histories can be written, through evolutionary mechanisms, genetics and population dynamics. And you may know that in the post-war period, because of at least in the immediate post-war period, the disfavor of eugenics is a sort of a form of knowledge. There's an attempt to replace it with a kind of a population studies and population dynamics and population genetics. And in this way, the whole study of genomics and populations becomes avowedly and very intentionally a supposedly anti-racist project. This is the UNESCO position, that the new science of the post-war will be anti-racist because of the legacies of what has happened in the Pacific, in the Second World War, and also the Asia-Pacific War. Of course, that's not exactly what happened, and so what develops in the wake there are many attempts to sort of engage with things like the Human Genome Diversity Project of sampling, creating a sort of family of man vision of the human species overall, and how quickly that became entangled with imperial science, biocolonialism, and of course, decolonization. I want to just sort of suggest a few locations where this can be looked at. One is to understand that it's not just about a critique of good and bad science, but also that, of course, because of decolonization, there are other ways and other kinds of histories being told, which are then working against and in tandem with this. That is through the assertion of historic identities, and in particular focus on what we've heard already through the symposium on genealogical practices. Probably the most noted are the Maori practice of whakapapa and the Hawaiian the mo'oku ahau, which has been spoken of already. Now, these are not my traditions. My lines run elsewhere, but I'm obliged to those who are willing to share their knowledge and their understanding with me. And what we have are then different ideas of much of the kinds of knowledge that we have just heard about, and the creation in a kind of a scientific framework, and then knowledge about the past, which is about collective responsibility based on heritage and genealogy. The ideas of ancestral heritage, elaborations of the human and non-human realms, the connections to cosmologies, generations, and particularly the responsiveness to activism and historic transformations. So this is in multiple sites throughout the Pacific Islands. In ancestor tracing, about the probably long histories that foreground what is popular becomes sort of commercial, say, DNA testing, ancestry tracing, and the attempts through blood assays to molecular biology of determining ancestors and also origin questions throughout the 19th and early 20th century. Miley herself and other scholars here have worked. There's also quite a lot of work in voyaging and navigation. The famed Hokulea voyages of the 1970s, the Maori, the Great Fleet traditions, and also the way in which voyages of knowledge and voyaging itself becomes implicated in precisely genealogical kinds of questions. I'm thinking of Nalani Wilson Hokovitu's work on canoe-based histories, and also Keolu Fox, the genomic scientist, and human population genetics and responsibilities to community. The post-war period also encompasses questions linked to these of controversies. For example, in 2006, the notorious warrior gene controversy and the creation of a supposed gene inflection, which would determine ideas of tendencies toward aggression and violence, particularly in Maori men, and the way this image has been refracted through colonial ideas of masculinity and savagery, and warrior characteristics emanating from the British Empire and the civilizing missions that we've also heard about. Tai Teng and Brendan Hokovito have done much work in this area. There's also, just mentioned earlier, the freezer anthropologies, the rise of life patent capitalism and the ethical and legal implications of denoting quote unquote high value gene pools for Western research labs, and the evocation of customary law and legal protections in global debates about who owns genetic materials and who owns blood samples. And this came to a particularly notable moment in 1995 when Yokotan Ibeji, a New Guinea Hagahai man, was reputedly patented by the United States government for the ownership of his then immortalized cell line for laboratory research. A lot of these sort of instantiations sort of flow around the twin themes, which we see repeated here throughout the discussions about isolation and extinction. Isolation, the very logic of why it is that researchers are interested in islands and in putatively disappearing and small group communities, which have, they believe, no contact, as it were, suggested with the rest of the world, is because then the fiction of sort of the pure sample, the originary blood, and therefore the genetic material is deemed to be somehow uncontaminated by the rest of the world. This is true not just of peoples and genetic samplings, but also the historical world, botanicals, and moving up to contemporary biopiracy, whether it was sandalwood, spices, working through empires, up to the ways in which ancestors are constituted through, for example, the Kumara or the Taro, so that what we have is a world in which genealogical, that is through the Whakapapa or the Mo'uku'ahau, an understanding of genealogy, not just as a descent in a human pedigree line, but really a reconnection to a larger world. This is also true in the cases of the ways that, for example, in 1992 or so, the mamala tree in Samoa from the healer Epinesa malagoa was appropriated by biotech labs to produce antiretroviral treatments for the AIDS virus. There are also stories about blood quantum, defining membership in communities of indigeneity. Okay, Haulani's extensive work on that. The way in which the Nuclear-Free and Independent Pacific Treaty and the way in which radiation victims became longitudinal test subjects for American nuclear colonialism. You may know that prior to this period, most of what was then genetic research was conducted on fruit flies and lab animals. It was sort of a small splinter field, but after 1945, human genetic research was almost half of it in the North American context was funded by the Atomic Energy Commission and by the Defense Department. There's also questions about the colonial dispossession of cultures and museum collections, which we've just heard about. One thing I find fascinating is Keolu Fox, the Hawaiian geneticist, his work on artifacts, which is, for example, the lei piho palaoa, which contains strands of human hair. And because he's a geneticist, he knows that one can actually sample human hair for DNA, and so these are not just artifacts, but they're ancestors, as he says it. And this requires a very different way of understanding what it is that one is actually encountering when thinking to do research. I'll just leave off with the where this is going, not to simply sort of offer a litany of difficult cases, but enterprise of genomic science itself, it has continuously been evolved, mostly by the number of the Mata'atua Conference on Indigenous Property and Knowledge, the United Nations Conventions on Indigenous Rights, in which key figures like Aroha Pareake contributed directly, and the summer internships for Indigenous Genomics, the SING initiative for involving more Indigenous communities and young students in genomics, including developments in the US, where it started in Canada and Aotearoa in Australia, and the work of really not just better science regarding Indigenous communities, but better science by Indigenous scientists and practitioners themselves. And these stories and these sort of interventions in the way that histories are told then mark these affirmations of bloodlines and of heritages as lived history, of genealogy, of inheritance, and in all cases of obligation. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Matt. Our last presenter on this panel is Nate Rue. And the title of his talk will be Hau'ofa, Eugenics, and Colonization in Oceania. Nate Rue is a Papua New Guinean doctoral candidate at the University of Auckland, whose work focuses on traditions of collective Oceanian and Pacific identities. In particular, he approaches Hau'ofa's notion of Oceania through critical theory to examine the legacies of anti-Black violence in the Pacific and the colonization of water. Thanks. I'll hand it over to you, Nate.
All right, cool. Kia ora, I'm Nate. As was mentioned, I'm a doctoral candidate at the University of Auckland. My work focuses on legacies of anti-Blackness, and particularly the work of Epeli Hau'ofa. In this respect, the Border Political Project, this paper I commit myself to, is the search for an affirmation of a new Oceania, a collective regional Oceanian relationality which navigates difference in the multiplicity of Oceania, recognizing our Pacific traditions and customs as fundamentally important and critical, but also trying to move collectively together. So as Hau'ofa kind of points out in his essay, Anthropology in the Pacific Islanders, and just forewarning, I'm a sociologist and a philosopher, so my entry into anthropology in this conversation is through Hau'ofa. So rather, as Hau'ofa points out in his essay, Anthropology in Pacific Islanders, the tensions and navigations of difference are central to his ideas around thinking collective identities and moving towards a new Oceania. So in Anthropology in Pacific Islanders, Hau'ofa examines the ways in which anthropology as a field has been complicit in the fundamental mischaracterizations and misrepresentations of Pacific cultures and ways of being. In particular, he highlights the ways in which difference and diversity of the Pacific, in which the notions of difference and diversity of the Pacific have fed into colonial capitalist narratives of development and sociocultural progress, right? Where often the difference and the deviations that occur across the populations have been utilized as a means of demonstrating or articulating why they're less developed, right? So through representations of Melanesia or what I call Black Oceania as a veritable Tower of Babylon, bereft of a common language, anthropology has historically utilized difference and diversity to make sense of and rationalize the slow pace of development in Melanesia. This, of course, obscuring the political and economic roots of this in exploitation and extraction. I guess it is in this respect, with this understanding of power and the power operations underpinning these diminished views of the Pacific, this emphasis of difference and deviation, that this paper turns to the question of eugenics and its function, particularly in the ways in which it has been used to other Melanesia and Black Oceanian subjects. This is, of course, then ground normative assumption of a good, or the EU in eugenics, as part of a biopolitical order which polices difference. As Miley Alvin, as well as Vanessa Andriotti and Sharon Stein demonstrate, the colonial project and its biopolitical mechanisms have undergone a number of shifts, So prior to development of the kind of, I guess, hard science of the Enlightenment, difference and deviation in terms of separating populations was, of course, structured on civilization and social schemas of good and bad or progressive and regressive societies. Through the Enlightenment, we saw the development of sciences, which sought to interpret and understand the differences and deviations of population under, I guess, biological and pseudoscientific schemas. However, in both these instances, the key movement was explaining and understanding difference and making sense of that order in relation to the interests of colonial capitalism, of those projects of exploitation, right? It's about utilizing and focusing on this difference and differentiation in the interests of maintaining disparity, of maintaining exploitation and exploitative practices. And this I lean on French philosopher Jacques Rancière's notion of policing, which reminds us that the function of modern power is to impose and construct schematics of who does and does not count, whose complaint or disagreement is interpreted as being as genuine or legitimate, whose voice is counted as actually being part of the population, right? So in this respect, eugenics has functioned historically as a means to provide a biomedical logic for discounting and miscounting populations, to inhibit and diminish their capacities for autonomy and self-rule. And here we see the glowing words, or the paternalistic logics of progress, helping, and development as being kind of the key mechanisms through which these ideas are proliferated. And thus, the police operation of colonial capitalism then has been weaponized in the eugenics and biomedical models to undermine, to break difference and deviance, to construct it as the fundamental bad opposed to the you of eugenics, right? So under this, the you of eugenics, the good genetics is often and fundamentally constructed around the white subjectivity, the white body, and difference, deviation from the norm, from this assertion of the good is bad, right? This is, however, an ongoing project. While, eugenics was more accepted historically, its operations and its legacies as part of the schemas of contemporary bioscientific racism are undergoing a resurgence today. So prior to the 70s, 80s, we see a focus on populations more broadly in terms of differentiating populations from each other. And while this is often the case under neoliberalism, the shift in eugenics and biological racism has turned to focus on individuals and comparative individuals. And so, as Matt was talking about, we get the proliferation of individual genetic profiles, DNA testing, ancestral claims, and the likes. In this, then, it's focused on more. There was, I think, a shift, perhaps, and perhaps there's no longer a shift, but I think there was a shift towards more individuated constructions of biomedical difference and deviation, and adopting the logics of neoliberalism and highly individualization. We saw this kind of, oh yeah, this is another way of like being individual, of being unique, of differentiating myself, but still fundamentally operating under the kind of logics of colonial capitalism, which holds everything in cohesion. However, in the post-Trump era and the possible turn away from neoliberalism, which Trump and other kind of reactionary right-wing and white supremacist politicians have pushed us, we're seeing, I guess, a resurgence in the more whole-scale, broader conversations around population disparity and difference. We're of course seeing this language, the ways in which difference and deviance are being weaponized within the context of, for example, Palestine and around the world. Similarly or simultaneously, we've seen this resurgence come through in the post-COVID era, where again the shift has been from, I guess, the neoliberal individualized notions of genetic profiles to more collective, broader scientific attempts to understand populations through COVID-19 and its kind of forced us into this more broader analysis of how these things are at play. So as the political order of the world faces shifts again, we need to be wary of the ways in which colonial capitalism both utilizes and, I guess, has shaped or reshaped or attempts to kind of reassert its power and control over disparate populations, and naturalizing its order, right? Because that's one of the fundamental things in which this eugenics operates, and one of the ways in which Enlightenment humanism, which Stein and Andreotti kind of point to, is that in terms of assuming this kind of notion of progress or scientific development, even through logics of biology, we see a kind of implementation or imposition of a means of retroactively justifying the violence. If this is the way in which society progresses and develops, if this is how things have gone, then the steps which have taken prior to us can be justified through a kind of utilitarian or ends justifies the means type logic. At the same time, however, right, the point for Oceania is that we're not trying to move towards homogenizing Oceania. It's not railing against the difference in that constitutes, for example, Melanesian language groups. The point is not to turn away from difference. It's to recognize that difference, the deviation, that population difference, and all these kind of things are fundamental and critical to our survival going forward, right? Hau'ofa is really clear, for example, in the New South Pacific Society and in The Ocean and Us, that the goal is not in moving towards a collective or a new Oceania, the goal is not to erase our differences and disparities. It's to recognize them as being critical and important, as being essential to who we are. And so I guess I'm going to keep it short, and maybe we can jump into question time. But I did want to finish on a quote from Audre Lorde, which I think is kind of really important for understanding or thinking through the relevance of difference and deviation in populations as we go forward. And so she kind of writes in Age, Race, and Class and Sex, Woman Redefining Difference, that certainly there is very real differences between us of race, age, and sex, but it's not these differences between us that are separating us. It is rather a refusal to recognize those differences and to examine the distortions which result from our misnaming them and their effects upon human behavior and expectation. So it's not that we have differences, is that we live in a colonial capitalist society, which will interpret the biological, the genetic differences and disparities between us or under a schema of power which serves to pathologize, to undermine our autonomy and authority, and to tug away at our kind of power in these contexts and situations. Yep.
Yeah, thanks so much, Nate. And yeah, we have at least a few minutes for questions or discussions. I could invite all of the panelists to come back on camera. Thanks. We have a question from Patty Poa. I think a couple questions wrapped into her comment. One for me about how eugenics impacts Hawaiians today, and one for Ingrid about just saying that you spoke about science, but I noticed religious language. How does that impact eugenics? Yeah, Ingrid, do you want to take that? I'll think about an answer tonight.
I can certainly try. Thanks for this question, Patty. I think it's important, and I like that you pick up on the idea of like religious language. I'd love to hear exactly what terms you were thinking about, but I do want to tie it in perhaps to sort of what Nate was saying about the EU, the good in eugenics. Right, because I think it's interesting, the idea of pathologizing and the good and bad, and how so much of the idea of, like, I think Nate and I both kind of talked a little bit about those glowing terms and the problem of those glowing terms, right, to justify the end, justify the means. And so I think that good part's really interesting in terms of religious language, perhaps, because I certainly think that, again, the conglomeration, you've got this coalescing of New England, right? And the Northeast is where you've got these early philosophers. It's where the seats of governmental power were in the beginning of the United States. It's also, right, the Protestant sort of hotbed, which is part of that idea of who is good and bad. There's also this idea in Protestantism that is like you can better yourselves, and you should constantly be putting yourself forward as being good and improving, and that sort of aligns with eugenics. I don't know if that's exactly what you're getting at, but I do think that you're never going to, you can't talk about the United States as a nation without talking about that early sort of religious aspect, and so I think it's going to trickle through everywhere. So that's just kind of my immediate response. So, but I'm sure other people may have thoughts on that too.
Did anyone else want to add to that discussion?
This is Matt. I'll just say on the religious language question, I mean, it's a really fascinating question. The at least in some of the things I was sketching out, one thing I did not mention was the I guess if you sort of think of this in sort of a straightforward sort of academic or societal way, a lot of these have been sort of taken up into the realm that we call bioethics today, which is to say that the involvement of churches, church councils, spiritual leaders about what is a creator, what is an origin, what are our ethical obligations are very, very important in all of this work. And some of it is, as I think Ingrid was just mentioning, there's a sort of a construct of sort of colonial thought about superiority of a certain kind of an Anglo-Saxon Protestant vision, perhaps. There was also in sort of indigenous appropriations of and also local religions. Yeah, there's very strong, a lot of spirituality is very tied up in how one sort of thinks about and considers what is proper to think of as a creator, an ancestor, and then what the obligations are carrying on, not only through the human line, but through the connection with all of nature and all of creation, as it's often referred to. So it's a really fascinating question. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, maybe I'll try to quickly answer Patty's question for myself, just on how eugenics impacts Hawaiians today. I think it's a hard question because I see a lot of ways it impacts Hawaiians today. Maybe the most obvious is in blood quantum legislation that perhaps Kehaulani Kaunui's book covers in detail, and perhaps she talked about yesterday. But just like legally, Hawaiians are still subject to a certain eugenic idea about who is counted in law or not. But I think my current research that I was talking about today, I think is speaking, I mean, it's not separate from that, but it's also speaking a bit more to some kind of broader ideas about just how unfit Native Hawaiians are to be parents or to be raising children. And I think that's also a really heavy legacy of eugenics discourses and research and policies that is even kind of more deeply embedded in some ways in Hawaii, and perhaps harder to also kind of reckon with and heal. But of course, a lot of people are. And some of my work, like the schools that I mentioned, not Waimano, but the other ones were recently named in a U.S. federal report on boarding schools that, is a lot about the boarding schools that work to assimilate Native Americans on the U.S. continent. But obviously, that's also happening in Hawaii with some differences. But anyway, I think a lot of my work that I'm doing right now is trying to kind of contextualize these schools in Hawaii for a Hawaiian audience that has not generally understood Hawaii as having boarding schools of the kind that Native Americans did. And so I feel like, we're still really kind of reckoning with some of those issues that we haven't necessarily confronted directly yet, in part because there's not been a lot of research on this history in Hawaii. So, but yeah, I think I have a website for my research project. I'll put in the chat in case folks are interested in following along. Let's see. I think we should have time for another question. Let's see. Maybe all right, I think so. We have a question from Nalani Wilson Hokufitu. And she says she's interested in the examples about ancestral connections to the Ali'i collection and the lay Niho Palawa. And so she was hoping that you could elaborate on how this might inform museology. And she didn't specify, but I'm guessing maybe Matt could speak to that.
Yeah, I did mention this specifically. So aloha, Nalani. Thank you for the question. That is work very directly connected with Keolu Fox, the Kanaka Maoli genomicist and genetic scholar. What I mentioned was what he is very much interested in. The part that I did mention was that to look at the collections, not only very much, I should say not only, I say very much as ancestral and repatriation questions, as we've discussed here in this panel, but also that because in this case with the lei, it is very much, of course, carved from a whale's tooth, and then it is also very finely braided strands of human hair, and human hair samples also taken by Tinsdale and Birdsall and in the Australian context, excuse me, can actually be sort of reconstituted through DNA science to trace back to particular heritages and try to almost create sort of like an identity. So this is why he was talking about it very much in terms of it being an ancestor, not just an ancestral sort of an artifact or a piece. That then is very much about the questions about sovereignty and about the persistence of the way in which the samples are sort of utilized. As he points out, this is something which only someone like a genome scientist knows, is that when one sort of extracts material in order to create these samples, they're also altered, and in some cases they're destroyed. So you can't actually know the past without also destroying it. And so this is one of the big questions also around what museology is. To me, the interesting question that I found is fascinating in this panel from everybody, because we all touched on certain things similarly. And I'll just refer it back to what Ingrid began with the archive. But everyone spoke about this in different ways, which is that the way in which a certain kind of practice is very keen on preserving and archiving samples and data, and not at all concerned about preserving and conserving lives, cultures, experiences. And so that's fascinating. Why is it so important to keep the information, but then to lose the entire society while doing so?
Yeah, thank you, Matt. I think I'll try to get back to Patty had some questions for our other panelists as well. I think maybe for Nathan, she had a question about capitalism is the move from societies with markets to a market society, and bankers are a cause of the breakdown of our society. How do you think it impacts Indigenous peoples?
Yeah, so I think in this respect, I tend to use the language of colonial capitalism as a kind of singular or a twin kind of power operation, in terms of we see from the very kind of early stages of the slave trade is where we also see the formation of finance capital kind of come into play. So you see in terms of market economies, financing and insurance and the kind of modern schemas of banking and those kind of things, they kind of come into play during the period of the slave trade, through the kind of development of joint stock companies, and the way of pooling money to insure slave ships so that they can return, and that you would get return on your investment for going on these kind of long, arduous journeys across the oceans. So I think they fundamentally operate together, and as we kind of saw through the ways in which neoliberalism has potentially shifted, ways in which eugenics has functioned, and the ways in which indigenous kind of populations relate to it. The economic system is a superstructure which has widespread effects on these kind of systems, and I think in terms of the impact on indigenous people, right? It's the same as the impact of colonialism on indigenous people. We've seen land dispossession. We've seen all these kind of things, right? They're all part of the same kind of project. Eugenics and the kind of bioscientific model has often functioned to provide an explanation or a pseudo explanation for why this exploitation and extraction has taken place, and obscures the fact of the exploitation and extraction through a claim about the population in particular, as opposed to the broader global socioeconomic system.
So I was basically just saying thank you to all the panelists and to all the audience members for their questions and comments. I know we have another panel scheduled to start in a minute, so I thought maybe we could just wrap up here with great gratitude and mahalo to everybody. Thank you so much, Ingrid, Hillary, Matt, and Nate, for all your wonderful talks. And yeah, well, give us a minute, and I think the next panel will get started pretty shortly.